The year is 1922, deep in the Bavarian countryside of Germany. Imagine a world without the hum of highways, without the glow of city lights on the horizon. Instead, you stand on a dirt road cutting through endless fields, the kind of road where you can hear your own footsteps echo because no one else is around. The nearest neighbour might be half a mile away, and when the sun sets, the night is so dark that every shadow seems alive. This is the world of Hinterkaifeck, a small, isolated farmstead where 6 people lived quietly, until one night they were wiped out in a crime so brutal, so chilling, that more than a century later we still whisper about it. The family was not extraordinary. They were ordinary in the way so many rural families were after World War I, scarred by the past, wary of strangers and focused on survival. The patriarch, Andreas Gruber, was 63 years old, a hard and stubborn man. His wife, Cecilia, was 72, weathered by years of farm labour and the constant demands of raising children and grandchildren. Their daughter, Victoria, 35, lived with them along with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. Also living on the farm was a maid named Maria, who had just arrived, replacing another servant who had abruptly quit, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. Already you can feel the sense of unease. In cities today, when someone quits a job suddenly, we chalk it up to stress, poor conditions, or better opportunities. But in a place like Hinterkaifeck, where there was no rush hour commute, no office chatter, no traffic horns, just silence, wind in the trees, and the creak of wooden beams, a servant leaving because she heard noises in the house hit differently. People whispered that she was scared. She claimed she heard footsteps in the attic, though no one was ever found. To a rural Bavarian in 1922, that wasn't just a complaint. It was an omen. The Gruber family stayed. They were used to being alone, used to ignoring gossip. Andreas especially was known to be difficult, even harsh. He quarrelled with neighbours, demanded obedience from those under his roof, and kept his farm running with rigid control. His daughter Victoria lived under his shadow, even after her husband's death during the war. She sang in the local church choir and was well liked, but she never truly escaped her father's dominance. Some even whispered that Josef, the toddler, might not have been her late husband's child, that Andreas himself was the father. In a modern context, that idea chills us with its ugliness, but back then, in a small isolated community, it was the kind of rumour that everyone knew, yet no one dared to speak too loudly. Still, life at Hinterkaifeck went on as usual. The family rose with the sun, tended to the livestock, worked the fields, and returned to the farmhouse at night. It was monotonous, but safe, or so they thought. Then the strange things began. One day Andreas noticed footprints in the snow. They led from the forest straight to the farmhouse. That in itself wasn't strange. Hunters, wanderers, or even children could have walked that way. But when he followed them, he realised something was wrong. There were no footprints leading back. Whoever walked to Hinterkaifeck had never left. He searched the property but found no intruder. The barns, the tools, the fields, everything seemed untouched. The only thing that lingered was a creeping feeling, like someone was still watching. More oddities followed. Keys went missing. A newspaper from Munich was found on the porch, though no one in the family subscribed and no neighbours admitted to leaving it. At night, Andreas swore he heard footsteps in the attic, but when he searched, the space was empty. To us today, this sounds like the plot of a horror movie. The slow drip of unease, little details piling up until you start doubting your own senses. But for the Grubers, it was daily life. And in an age without phones, without street lamps, without neighbours you could call at a moment's notice, those details carried a heavier weight. The maid who worked there before Maria had quit because of these very things. She said she felt watched, and the noises in the attic convinced her the farm was cursed. When Maria Hoffner arrived to take her place, she didn't know that she was walking into the middle of something sinister. Her first night in the house would be her last. It was the evening of March 31st, 1922, when everything changed. The Grubers finished their chores as usual. The children were tucked into bed, the animals secured in the barn. Perhaps they ate a simple meal together, bread, soup, maybe some cheese, by the glow of oil lamps. No one outside the family knows what those last hours looked like, but what we do know is that sometime that night, an intruder entered the property. The order of the killings has been debated for years, but the most accepted version is this. One by one, the family members were lured into the barn. Andreas, then Cecilia, then Victoria, then little 7-year-old Cecilia. Each was killed with a mattock, a kind of pickaxe used on farms. The blows were savage, crushing skulls, leaving no chance of survival. After that, the killer moved inside the farmhouse. He found the maid, Maria, asleep in her room. He killed her too. Finally, he went to the toddler Joseph, asleep in his cot. The child was struck down without mercy. 6 lives ended in one night. What makes this crime even more chilling is what happened afterward. The killer didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stayed. For days, neighbours saw smoke rising from the chimney. The animals in the barn were fed and tended. Someone cooked meals in the kitchen. Whoever committed the murders made themselves at home in Hinterkaifeck, living among the corpses until the bodies were discovered nearly a week later. Imagine that for a moment in modern terms. If a family didn't show up to school, work or church, people would call or message instantly. Police would be notified within hours. But in 1922, rural Germany, life moved at a different pace. When the Grubers didn't appear at church on Sunday, people grew suspicious. When they missed other appointments, neighbours began to investigate. Eventually, on April 4th, a search party entered the farm. What they found in the barn was beyond anything they could have imagined. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, Victoria, and little Cecilia lay stacked one on top of the other, covered with hay as if to hide them. Maria's body was discovered in her chamber, and baby Josef in his cot. The scene was brutal, but it also carried a strange, eerie order. The animals were calm, well fed. Tools had been used. Someone had lived there after the murders, going about daily routines as if nothing had happened. The villagers recoiled in horror. In a world without forensics as we know it today, the scene was contaminated almost immediately. Neighbours, police, even curious onlookers swarmed the property. Evidence was disturbed, clues were lost. But one thing was clear. This was not a random act of violence. Whoever killed the Grubers had been watching them, waiting for the right time. And so the legend of the Hinterkaifeck murders began. The discovery of the Gruber family's bodies on April 4th, 1922 sent shockwaves through the small Bavarian community. In a village where gossip usually revolved around crops, church attendance and neighbourly disputes, the scene at Hinterkaifeck was unimaginable. 6 people. A family wiped out, their bodies hidden under hay and sheets, while someone had continued to live in the house as if nothing had happened. In modern times, such a crime scene would be cordoned off immediately. Forensics teams would photograph every angle, bag every item, and swab every surface for DNA. But in 1922, rural Germany had no such procedures. The crime scene became chaotic. Villagers crowded into the barn, peeking at the corpses. Some even touched the bodies, pointing at wounds, whispering about curses or supernatural punishment. By the time investigators from Munich arrived, much of the evidence had been trampled or tampered with. It was as if the farm itself swallowed the truth before anyone could grasp it. The police began their work with what they had: eyewitness accounts, the arrangement of the bodies, and the strange details around the farm. One of the first mysteries was the timing. The Grubers had been dead for several days before discovery, yet neighbours reported smoke rising from the chimney and animals being cared for. This suggested the killer remained on the farm. But why? Was it arrogance, sadism, or practicality, hiding until it felt safe to leave? In today's terms, it's like imagining a murderer checking your email, eating your food, and watering your plants after killing you. It's not only terrifying, but deeply unsettling in its casualness. The investigation quickly turned towards suspects. Andreas Gruber was not a well-loved man. He had feuded with neighbours, argued with townsfolk, and carried a reputation for cruelty. His relationship with his daughter Victoria was especially troubling. Rumours of incest circulated in the village, whispers that Josef, her 2-year-old son, was not fathered by her late husband but by Andreas himself. These rumours were not baseless. In fact, court records showed that years earlier, both Andreas and Victoria had been convicted of incest. Andreas served a prison sentence, while Victoria's was suspended. This cast a dark shadow over the household, making it clear that whatever secrets lived inside Hinterkaifeck, they were not ordinary family troubles. One theory suggested that Victoria's relationship with another man, a neighbour named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, played a role. Schlittenbauer had courted Victoria after her husband's death, and many believed he was the true father of Joseph. He even admitted to giving her money at one point, possibly in hopes of marriage, but Victoria reportedly wanted to end things, leaving him bitter. After the murders, suspicion quickly fell on him. He was among the first villagers to enter the farm after the family went missing, and his behaviour struck some as odd. For example, while others recoiled in horror, he moved through the house confidently, even unlocking doors and entering rooms without hesitation. Some claimed this showed familiarity, perhaps too much familiarity. Did he have a spare key? Had he been inside the house before? Yet despite suspicion, nothing tied him directly to the murders. His alibi held, and police lacked evidence. The community remained divided. Some believed him guilty, others thought he was unfairly targeted because of his past with Victoria. Beyond Schlittenbauer, investigators explored other possibilities. Could it have been a robbery? At first glance it made sense. A remote farm, isolated family, few defences. But money and valuables were still in the house, untouched. Whoever killed the Grubers wasn't there for quick cash. Another theory pointed to vagrants or passing criminals. The Grubers lived near a forest that could shelter wanderers. Footprints leading to the house suggested someone came from the woods. But again, why stay for days afterward? Why feed the animals, cook meals, and sleep under the same roof as 6 corpses? That behaviour didn't fit a random drifter. The more investigators looked, the stranger the case became. Consider this. The killer stacked the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia in the barn, covering them neatly with hay. Inside the house, Maria and Joseph were also covered, one with a sheet, the other with a dress. This suggested a twisted sense of order, maybe even remorse. Killers who cover their victims are often thought to feel guilt or shame, but at the same time the murders themselves were merciless. The 7-year-old Cecilia had clumps of her own hair torn out, likely from sheer terror before her death. That level of violence was deeply personal. Police called in specialists from Munich, but the case stretched their abilities. Forensics in the 1920s relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, handwriting analysis, and motive-based questioning. The idea of profiling, trying to understand a killer's psychology, was still in its infancy. Yet even by modern standards, the case was a puzzle. A killer who enters a house days before, lingers unseen, strikes with brutal efficiency, then calmly integrates into daily life. It reads like a psychological nightmare. Over the years, countless suspects emerged. Some believed it was a former farmhand who knew the property well. Others thought it was revenge from someone Andreas had wronged. Even military deserters were considered. But every lead fizzled. One of the strangest aspects of the case is the maid, Maria Hoffner. She arrived on the very day of the murders. Imagine that. You begin a new job, unpack your things, and within hours you are dead. It raises chilling questions. Did the killer know a new maid was coming? Did her presence disrupt some plan? Or was her death simply tragic coincidence? The more one digs into Hinterkaifeck, the more it feels less like a crime and more like a haunting. Neighbours spoke of hearing strange noises from the farm long before the murders. The maid who quit described the house as cursed. Andreas himself told others about the mysterious footprints and attic sounds, yet he stayed. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to say we'd leave immediately. But rural life in the 1920s didn't allow for easy escape. The farm was their livelihood, their anchor. Abandoning it meant abandoning survival, and so they stayed, until staying cost them everything. After months of investigation, the police admitted defeat. The case went cold. Files were reopened in later years, suspects re-examined, but no arrest was ever made. In 1923, the farmhouse itself was demolished. Villagers couldn't stand the sight of it, a constant reminder of the horror within. At the site, a shrine was erected for the victims, and it still stands today. Yet the theories never stopped. Some modern researchers believe Lorenz Schlittenbauer remains the most likely culprit, driven by jealousy or anger over Victoria and Joseph. Others think it was someone with intimate knowledge of the farm, perhaps a former worker. Still others lean toward the supernatural, noting the eerie prelude of sounds, footprints and omens. The lack of closure feeds the legend. In a way, the Hinterkaifeck murders represent the perfect storm of horror. An isolated setting, a dysfunctional family, a killer who lingers in the shadows, and an investigation crippled by time and circumstance. It's the kind of story that unsettles us precisely because it has no resolution. Unlike modern cases where DNA, surveillance cameras or phone records can crack open even the most carefully concealed crime, Hinterkaifeck remains sealed in silence. One of the more haunting details that investigators uncovered was the timeline of the killings. Based on the condition of the bodies, they estimated the murders took place on the night of March 31st. Yet for the next several days, life on the farm appeared normal to outsiders. Smoke rose from the chimney. The animals were fed. Even the family dog was tied up and cared for. Neighbours later recalled seeing little Kazelia absent from school and Victoria missing from choir practice, but they assumed illness or farm duties had kept them. Only after mail piled up and appointments were missed did suspicions rise. This period of normal activity is what continues to disturb people most. It suggests the murderer wasn't merely passing through. They didn't strike quickly and leave in panic. They stayed, perhaps even sleeping in the same beds, using the same tools, eating at the same table as the family they had slaughtered. Imagine today if a crime scene investigator discovered that, after a family's murder, someone logged into their Wi-Fi, cooked in their kitchen, or turned on their TV. It's that same eerie violation, a blending of routine life with horrific violence. When the farmhouse was finally searched, investigators noticed that doors and locks showed no signs of forced entry. Either the killer had been inside long before the attack, hidden in the attic or barn, or they were someone familiar enough to be let in willingly. This raised chilling questions. Did the Grubers unknowingly share their home with a hidden presence for days? Or did they open their doors to someone they trusted, never realizing betrayal waited on the other side? Theories about the killer's identity spread quickly. Let's walk through the major ones. Erster Lawrence Schlittenbauer. The neighbour most often accused. His relationship with Victoria was complicated. Some said he was Josef's true father, others noted his bitter disputes with Andreas. His strange calmness at the crime scene made villagers whisper. He unlocked doors easily, he moved about without fear. But he always denied involvement, and no evidence ever pinned the crime to him. 2. A vagrant or robber. The idea that someone wandering the woods stumbled upon Hinterkaifeck, killed for money and hid there. But valuables were untouched, and few criminals would risk staying for days afterward. 3. A former worker. The farm had many hired hands over the years. Some had grievances against Andreas, who was notoriously harsh. A former worker might have known the property well enough to move confidently and avoid suspicion. 4. A personal vendetta. Andreas's reputation for cruelty extended beyond his family. Perhaps someone wronged by him in the past sought revenge, but if so, why kill everyone, including children and a maid who had just arrived? 5. A family secret. The most disturbing possibility is that the crime grew from within. Incest rumours, family tension and whispered disputes suggested deep dysfunction. Could one member have snapped and turned on the rest? Or had someone close to the family decided to end the cycle of abuse in the most final way? Despite these theories, nothing conclusive emerged. Police records detailed dozens of interviews, handwriting comparisons and examinations of tools and weapons, but none yielded a breakthrough. In frustration, investigators even decapitated the victims' bodies, sending the skulls to clairvoyants in hopes of spiritual insight. No visions came, and the skulls themselves vanished during World War II bombings. To this day, the victims' graves are marked by headstones with no heads beneath them. The longer the case lingered, the deeper it sank into folklore. Some villagers claimed to hear cries on the wind when passing the site. Others swore that the demolished farm's ruins were cursed. The very land seemed stained, as if the soil refused to forget. In modern times, true crime enthusiasts, historians and amateur sleuths have revisited Hinterkaifeck endlessly. Online forums debate the evidence, podcasts retell the story, and researchers dig through old files. Some claim advances in forensic science could solve the case if physical evidence still existed, but with the farmhouse gone, the tools destroyed, and the skulls missing, much has been lost forever. What remains is a story that lingers like a shadow. Imagine yourself walking that same dirt road today. The fields quiet around you. There is no farmhouse anymore, only a memorial cross where it once stood. Birds sing overhead, the wind moves through the grass, and for a moment it feels like peace has returned. But if you pause, if you let yourself think about what happened there, you realise how thin the barrier is between ordinary life and unthinkable violence. One night in 1922 that barrier broke, and 6 people never saw another dawn. The Hinterkaifeck murders endure because they refuse to be explained. Every theory makes sense, yet none fit perfectly. Every suspect seems plausible, yet none were convicted. It is a story trapped in the silence of time, where the killer walks away nameless, leaving only unanswered questions behind. And perhaps that's why, even a century later, people still whisper about the footsteps in the attic, the missing keys, the phantom footprints in the snow. Hinterkaifeck is not just a crime, it's a reminder that some truths are destined to remain in the dark. If you made it this far into the video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps keep this going. The Villisca Axe Murders. The year is 1912. Villisca, Iowa is a small, quiet town where life moved at a steady, predictable pace. Think of a place where everyone knows one another, where neighbours wave from porches, where church bells mark the hours. A rural American town in the early 20th century, safe enough that people left doors unlocked, trusting their community to protect them. Villisca wasn't a place where nightmares lived. It was a place of Sunday services, children playing in the streets and family gatherings. But on one summer night, everything changed, and Villisca became a name forever tied to horror. The victims were the Moore family, pillars of their community. Josiah Moore, known as Joe, was 43 years old, a successful businessman who ran a farm equipment store. He was respected and active in his church. His wife, Sarah, was 39, devoted to her family and also deeply involved in church work. They had 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, just 5. The Moores lived in a modest white house on a quiet residential street, the kind of home that blended into the town like any other. June 9th, 1912, was a Sunday, and for the Moores, it was busy but joyful. The day centred around the local Presbyterian church, where Sarah coordinated a special Children's Day programme. This was an annual event with songs, recitations and community pride in the talents of the younger generation. Sarah worked tirelessly to organise it, and that evening the Moores attended the programme together. They weren't alone. 2 neighbour girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, aged 8 and 12, had been invited by Catherine Moore to spend the night after the festivities. Their parents agreed, thinking nothing of it. Sleepovers were common, and the Moore household was safe. When the programme ended around 9:30 p.m, the group walked home together. It was a warm June evening, the kind where the streets hummed with insects and the glow of kerosene lamps lit the way. By 10 p.m, the Moore home was quiet, its lamps extinguished, its residents settling into sleep. No one could have imagined that within hours, every soul inside would be gone. Sometime after midnight, a figure entered the Moore house. The exact time remains uncertain, but investigators later believe the killer waited until the family was asleep before striking. The weapon was an axe, Josiah's own, taken from his property. The intruder moved room to room, beginning upstairs where Josiah and Sarah slept. They were attacked with devastating blows to the head. The force was so great that it gouged the ceiling. The children in the other rooms followed. Herman, Catherine, Boyd and Paul all killed in their beds. Then the killer turned to the Stillinger sisters, asleep in the guest room. They too were bludgeoned to death. What makes the Villisca murders especially chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the strange ritual-like details left behind. After the killings, the murderer covered the victims' faces with cloth sheets or clothing. Mirrors throughout the house were draped with fabric, as though the killer couldn't bear to see their own reflection. An uneaten plate of food sat on the kitchen table, abandoned. A slab of bacon was left leaning against the wall in the guest room, another wrapped in a towel on the floor. Some believe these were tokens of madness, others that they symbolised something more disturbing. By the next morning, when the Moores failed to appear for daily chores, neighbours grew suspicious. Mary Peckham, who lived next door, noticed the house unusually quiet. By 8 a.m, she called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to investigate. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled strange, heavy with the metallic tang of blood. The silence was oppressive. In the guest room, Ross discovered the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger, their small forms lying still. Horrified, he fled and called the authorities. Sheriff Hank Horton soon arrived, and what he found shocked the entire town. One by one, the victims were uncovered. The Moores, the Stillinger girls, all murdered in their sleep. The axe, still stained, was found in the house. Villisca had gone from a peaceful town to the scene of one of the most gruesome murders in American history. Word spread quickly. In an era before television or social media, news travelled by whispers, church bells and telegrams. Within hours, hundreds of townspeople gathered outside the Moore house. Many pushed their way inside before the authorities could stop them, contaminating the scene. People touched objects, peered at bodies, even took fragments as grisly souvenirs. The investigation was compromised from the very beginning. The sheer savagery of the crime stunned everyone. How could someone creep into a family home, slaughter 8 people, 6 of them children, and vanish into the night without being caught? It was the kind of horror that felt alien in small-town America, yet here it was, in the heart of Villisca. The funeral, held just days later, was one of the largest gatherings the town had ever seen. Thousands came, mourning not just the victims but the loss of their own sense of safety. Doors that had never been locked before were bolted shut each night. Neighbours who once trusted each other began to glance with suspicion. The town of Villisca was forever changed. And yet the question loomed: who could have committed such an atrocity? Theories swirled, suspects were named, and investigations launched. But answers proved elusive. When the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were laid to rest, Villisca was no longer the same town it had been just a week earlier. The white frame house, once a symbol of stability and family life, became the most infamous building in Iowa. Fear gripped the town. Suspicion poisoned neighbourly trust, and the unanswered question, who could have done this, echoed louder with each passing day. The investigation was plagued from the very beginning. In 1912, law enforcement lacked many of the tools we rely on today. There was no DNA testing, no fingerprint databases, no modern forensic protocols. Worse, the crime scene had been contaminated beyond repair. Curious townsfolk had wandered through the Moore house before the authorities could secure it, touching objects, moving items, and leaving their own prints and footprints. Any chance at a clean investigation was gone within hours. Still, the authorities tried. They noted the peculiarities. The axe was found in the house, wiped of most fingerprints but still stained with blood. Every victim's face had been covered after death, a detail some criminologists interpret as a sign of shame or remorse. The mirrors and glass surfaces had been draped with cloth, a ritualistic touch that suggested either superstition or madness. And then there was the bacon. One slab found in the guest room, another wrapped on the floor. What could that mean? Was it the killer's food, a bizarre token, or part of some ritual we'll never understand? Despite these clues, the case quickly spiraled into rumour and theory. In a small town, every eccentric, every outsider, every man with a shadowy past became a suspect. Yet a few stood out more than others. The suspects. 1. Frank Jones. One of the earliest theories pointed to Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator. Josiah Moore had once worked for him at his hardware store before striking out on his own and taking with him a highly profitable account with the John Deere Company. This bred bad blood between the two men. Rumours also swirled that Josiah may have had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Did Frank Jones hire someone to settle the score? It was never proven, but the suspicion lingered, fueled by political rivalry and small-town gossip. 2. William Blackie Mansfield. A far more sinister suspect was William Mansfield, a drifter with a violent past. Mansfield was accused of murdering his own family 2 years later in Illinois. His wife, infant child, and parents-in-law using an axe. He was also suspected in a series of similar murders across the Midwest, where families were slaughtered in their beds with blunt weapons. Some investigators linked him to Villisca, suggesting he was a serial killer moving from town to town, yet evidence was thin, and Mansfield was eventually acquitted. 3. Reverend George Kelly. Perhaps the most infamous suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a travelling preacher with a troubled history. Kelly had attended the Children's Day programme the night of the murders and was seen leaving town early the next morning. He was eccentric, socially awkward, and known to send inappropriate letters to women. Years later, he confessed to the murders during a police interrogation. However, his confession was inconsistent and many believe it was coerced. At trial, Kelly was acquitted, though his name remains forever tied to the case. 4. The Axeman Theory. Some investigators believed the Villisca murders were not unique, but part of a string of axe murders that swept the Midwest in the early 1910s. Families in Kansas, Colorado, and Illinois were killed in eerily similar ways, bludgeoned in their beds, mirrors covered, lamps left dimmed. Could a transient killer have travelled by train, striking small towns before vanishing into the night? The similarities are striking, but no single suspect was ever caught. The trials and theories. In the years after the murders, Villisca became obsessed with finding justice. 2 grand jury investigations were held, focusing mostly on Reverend Kelly and Frank Jones. The trials drew national attention, and the Moore House became a macabre tourist attraction. Yet no convictions were ever secured. Every suspect had alibis or lacked sufficient evidence tying them to the crime. Over time, frustration turned to resignation. The town could not find its killer. Families locked their doors at night for the first time. Children were warned not to wander, and neighbours eyed one another with suspicion. Villisca, once ordinary, became synonymous with fear. The Moore House itself stood as a reminder. For decades it was a private residence, passed from owner to owner. Some refused to live in it, claiming it felt haunted. Others reported strange sounds, cold drafts, and an oppressive atmosphere. Today it operates as a museum and paranormal attraction, with visitors spending the night to experience its chilling aura. Some claim to hear children's voices, others the faint sound of an axe against wood. Why it remains unsolved. Looking back with modern eyes, the Villisca case is both tragic and maddening. With today's forensic technology, investigators might have solved it quickly. DNA on the axe, fingerprints in the house, or trace evidence left behind could have led directly to the killer. But in 1912, the science wasn't there, and the contamination of the scene destroyed much of what might have been useful. Theories continue to circulate. Some are convinced Reverend Kelly was guilty, pointing to his strange behaviour and confession. Others see Mansfield as the likely killer, part of a broader pattern of axe murders. Still others think Frank Jones had motive enough to arrange the crime, and then there are those who believe it will never be solved, that the Villisca axe murders belong to that rare, haunting category of crimes lost to history, forever fueling speculation. The legacy of Villisca. Over a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain one of America's darkest unsolved crimes. They have been the subject of books, documentaries, and ghost tours. The town itself has embraced the legacy, grim though it is, turning tragedy into history. Visitors walk the creaky floors of the Moore House, standing in the rooms where the family once laughed and lived, and where their lives were stolen. Perhaps that is what makes Villisca so haunting. It was not a city crime, not the work of organised gangs or urban violence. It was a small-town home, a place of safety and family, shattered in the dead of night. The story resonates because it reminds us that safety is fragile, that evil can slip in silently, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts, justice never comes. The Villisca axe murders are not just a story of death, they are a story of unanswered questions. Who walked into that house on June 9th, 1912? Who wielded the axe with such merciless fury? And why? After all this time, do we still not know? Perhaps we never will. The Axeman of New Orleans. The city of New Orleans in the late 1910s was a place unlike any other in America. The streets pulsed with music, the scent of Creole cooking filled the air, and the Mississippi River carried commerce, people, and culture through its veins. It was a city alive with rhythm, but also one with deep divisions. Immigrant communities, Italians, Irish, Germans, carved out neighbourhoods, each with its own businesses, churches, and ways of life. It was into this vibrant yet tense backdrop that one of the most chilling unsolved murder sprees in American history took place, the reign of the Axeman of New Orleans. It began quietly, without warning. In May 1918, grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were found in their home with their skulls smashed by an axe. Their throats had been slit with a razor blade, and the killer had lingered long enough to leave strange signs. The razor used belonged to Joseph's brother, who lived nearby. The door showed signs of forced entry, and a panel had been chiselled out, as though someone had slipped inside silently while the couple slept. A few weeks later, another attack. Louis Bassumer and his mistress were struck in their bed, also with an axe. She died of her wounds. Bassumer survived, but with severe head injuries. Police began to notice a pattern. The attacker didn't bring weapons of their own. Instead, they used axes or tools already found in the victims' homes, often left behind afterward. This was not a thief. This was someone who slipped into houses at night, moved silently through familiar spaces and attacked without warning. The city was gripped by fear. Families began double-barring their doors, sleeping with weapons by their beds, and staying awake through the night. New Orleans had faced crime before, but this was different. The Axeman wasn't targeting the wealthy or those with enemies. He seemed to choose ordinary families, many of them Italian grocers. His strikes were brutal, his entry methods chillingly clever. Often, he chiselled out a wooden panel in the back door, just large enough to reach through and unlock it. It was the kind of patient, practiced move that suggested planning. In August 1918, another attack shocked the city. Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, was struck while she slept. She survived, as did her baby, but her skull was fractured, her room soaked in blood. Again, an axe had been the weapon. Again, the killer vanished into the night. New Orleans was in panic. The newspapers began calling him the Axeman, and speculation spread like wildfire. Some said he was a madman. Others believed he targeted Italians out of prejudice. Still others whispered of supernatural origin, the demon, a phantom who could slip through walls and vanish at will. The Axeman struck again in March 1919, and this time he made himself known in a way no killer had before. A letter was delivered to the Times-Picayune, written in a taunting theatrical style. It began, "They have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman." The letter went on to describe his love of jazz music, and issued a chilling ultimatum. On the night of March 19th, 1919, every home that played jazz loudly would be spared. Those who did not, he warned, would feel the wrath of his axe. The effect was immediate. That night the city erupted in music. Every dance hall was packed. Families who had never cared for jazz before played records loudly in their homes. Musicians performed in the streets, knowing their sound might be their only protection. For one night, fear turned into a bizarre carnival of survival, where music itself was a shield against death. And true to his word, no one was killed that night. The Axeman wasn't finished. Later that year he struck again, killing more grocers, attacking families in their beds, and leaving chaos behind. His victims included Mike Pepitone, whose wife found him beaten to death, the walls splattered with blood. She described the scene as a nightmare beyond comprehension. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the Axeman vanished. No more murders, no more letters. He slipped into the shadows of history, leaving behind a trail of blood, fear, and one of the most peculiar episodes in American crime. What made the Axeman so terrifying wasn't just the murders. It was the uncertainty. He broke into homes without a sound, used weapons already inside, and often left survivors who had only fleeting glimpses of him. Witnesses described a tall figure, shadowy, perhaps wearing a hat, but nothing conclusive ever emerged. He could have been anyone. By the end of 1919, the city had returned to its rhythm, but the memory of the Axeman lingered. Parents locked their doors tighter, grocers watched their customers with suspicion, and jazz itself became linked forever with a night when music saved a city from terror. When the Axeman's letter appeared in the Times-Picayune in March 1919, it gave New Orleans one of the strangest nights in its history. Jazz bands played in every corner of the city. Families who had never hired musicians before brought them into their parlours. Dance halls overflowed with people clinging to music as a shield against death. The city, for one night, was united in rhythm, a living testament to fear and survival. But after the music faded, the murders continued. The police were under enormous pressure. By 1919, the Axeman had left behind a string of victims. The Maggios, Bassumer and his mistress, Anna Schneider, the Cortimiglias, and finally Mike Pepitone. In each case, the killer had entered silently, usually by chiselling out a door panel and attacked with an axe or razor. Most of the victims were Italian grocers, which fueled speculation that this was more than random violence. Investigators were split. Some believed the murders were the work of a madman who simply hated Italians, especially immigrant grocers who dominated small businesses in the city. Others suspected organised crime, that the Axeman killings were tied to mafia intimidation, punishing grocers who refused to pay protection money. New Orleans at the time had a growing Sicilian underworld presence, and some saw the murders as warnings. But if this was mafia business, it was unlike anything they had seen before. Too theatrical, too public, too reckless. The surviving victims described a shadowy figure, sometimes said to be tall, wearing dark clothes or a slouch hat. But in the chaos of a midnight attack, under the shock of blows to the head, witnesses could offer little clarity. The axeman remained faceless, a phantom who slipped away into the night. Several suspects were investigated. One was Joseph Mumphrey, a man with rumoured ties to extortion schemes in Italian communities. Years after the Axeman spree, he was shot to death in Los Angeles by a widow who claimed he had murdered her husband in New Orleans. Some modern writers have tied Mumphrey to the Axeman killings, suggesting he was a violent enforcer who turned murder into spectacle. But at the time, police had no evidence to connect him. Others looked at Clementine Barnabette, a young woman tied to a series of axe murders in nearby Louisiana. She confessed to being part of a voodoo cult that killed families with axes, but her credibility collapsed under scrutiny. Still, the similarities were eerie. Entire families killed in their beds, blunt force, and ritual overtones. Was she part of a wider pattern, or merely a disturbed woman taking credit for chaos? The police, for their part, failed to catch anyone. New Orleans law enforcement was hampered by corruption, limited forensic science, and the sheer panic that gripped the city. Each time the Axeman struck, they followed leads, arrested suspects, but released them for lack of proof. Witnesses contradicted one another, and rumours drowned out facts. What makes the Axeman unforgettable is not just the brutality of the murders, but the cultural imprint he left. His letter, claiming to be a demon from hell sparing jazz lovers, turned him into a figure larger than life. Unlike Jack the Ripper, who taunted police in London with calculated menace, the Axeman's letter embraced theatricality. He made himself part of the city's identity, tying his violence to its music. Even today, jazz musicians reference the story, and writers use it as a symbol of New Orleans' strange dance between beauty and darkness. After the murder of Mike Pepitone in October 1919, the trail went cold. The Axeman vanished as suddenly as he appeared. Some believe he was jailed for another crime, or perhaps he fled the city. Others think he was killed in silence, his identity buried with him. And then there are those who cling to the legend, that he was not human at all, but something darker, a spirit that fed on fear, bound to New Orleans' night streets. The legacy of the Axeman lives on in the city's folklore. Tour guides still tell his story in the French Quarter. Musicians nod to him in lyrics. Paranormal investigators claim his shadow lingers in the neighbourhoods he once terrorised. His reign lasted little more than a year, yet his name is remembered more than a century later, not just as a murderer, but as a mythic figure woven into the soul of New Orleans. Perhaps that is why his story endures. The Axeman was never caught, never identified, never unmasked. He remains an open question, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how thin the line is between order and chaos. In the heart of a city known for its music, he wrote himself into history with blood and with words. And when the jazz played on that March night, New Orleans danced in defiance, proving that even in terror, the human spirit seeks rhythm and light. The Axeman disappeared, but his echo never left. The Cleveland Torso Murderer. Cleveland in the 1930s was a city of contradictions. On one hand, it was an industrial powerhouse, its steel mills and factories fueling America's economy. On the other hand, the Great Depression had left thousands homeless, jobless, and desperate. Shanty towns sprawled across the city's edges, with makeshift huts and lean-tos lining the river valleys. One of the largest of these was Kingsbury Run, a stretch of rail yards, ravines, and slums where the forgotten of the city lived in poverty. It was here, among the discarded and the destitute, that a killer began to prowl. A murderer so brutal that his name still casts a shadow. The Cleveland Torso Murderer. The first known discovery came in September 1934. On the shores of Lake Erie, a young man found a mutilated body. Only the lower half remained, washed up on the sand. The legs were cleanly severed, the skin rubbed with some kind of chemical that left it red and rough. Investigators had no identity, no leads. The press labelled the victim the Lady of the Lake. At the time, it seemed an isolated horror, but it was only the beginning. By 1935, another body appeared, this time in Kingsbury Run itself. A decapitated male corpse was discovered, his head missing entirely. Weeks later, yet another victim surfaced, also decapitated, also mutilated with surgical precision. Police realised they were not dealing with random killings. A pattern was emerging. Someone was hunting in Cleveland. The media pounced, dubbing the unknown predator the Torso Murderer, or the Mad Butcher. The name reflected the grotesque nature of his crimes. The victims were often found in parts, torsos severed from limbs, heads missing, bodies stripped of identification. Forensic science in the 1930s could not keep up with the killer's brutality. Fingerprints were useless without hands. Dental records were impossible without skulls. The victims were often the poor, the transient, those with no one to report them missing. It was as though the killer deliberately chose prey that society ignored. Over the next 4 years, the killings escalated. At least 12 confirmed victims were found between 1935 and 1938, though some investigators believe the number may have been double that. Men, women, sometimes both at once. The only constant was the savagery. Bodies were discovered in vacant lots, garbage dumps, and even displayed in plain sight as if the killer wanted them found. In one chilling case, a pair of boys stumbled upon 2 headless corpses hidden in the bushes near the run. Fear gripped the city. Imagine walking home in Depression-era Cleveland, through streets already haunted by hunger and despair, and knowing that somewhere out there was a butcher who could strike without warning. People avoided Kingsbury Run, but the killer seemed to thrive on the area's shadows, its silence and its forgotten souls. The press coverage turned the case into a spectacle. Newspapers ran grisly headlines, often publishing sketches of the mutilated victims. Reporters speculated about the killer's identity. Was he a doctor, given the precision of the cuts? A butcher familiar with carving flesh? Or perhaps a sadist who relished dismemberment as a signature? By 1936, the killings had grown so notorious that the city demanded action, and so the case landed on the desk of Eliot Ness, Cleveland's Director of Public Safety. Ness was already famous as the prohibition agent who led the Untouchables against Al Capone. He was seen as incorruptible, a man who got results. If anyone could catch the Torso Murderer, it was Eliot Ness. But the killer was clever. Despite police raids, interrogations, and massive searches of Kingsbury Run, the murders continued. Bodies kept appearing, as if mocking the authorities. The killer seemed to know the city better than anyone, slipping in and out, leaving evidence that led nowhere. Some investigators believed he lived among the homeless, blending in. Others thought he was a respected professional, someone whose day job gave him both skill and cover. One of the most disturbing aspects was the display of the remains. Often torsos were left in plain view, as if to ensure discovery. In modern times, we might interpret this as a craving for attention, a desire to taunt law enforcement. Back then, it simply deepened the fear. It meant the killer wasn't hiding. He wanted Cleveland to see his work. The people of Cleveland grew restless. Whispers filled the taverns and streets. Parents warned children never to wander alone. Homeless men in Kingsbury Run eyed one another with suspicion, fearing that the killer might be one of their own. The Torso Murderer had turned an already struggling city into one where trust dissolved into paranoia. By 1938, after years of failure, Eliot Ness took drastic action. In what became known as the Kingsbury Run raids, police stormed the shantytown, arresting vagrants and burning the makeshift homes to the ground. Ness argued that this would flush out the killer, depriving him of cover, but instead the raids were seen as cruel, punishing the poor rather than finding justice. The killings continued even after the destruction of the run, and Ness's reputation suffered. The untouchable who brought down Capone could not catch Cleveland's butcher. By the late 1930s, the murders began to slow. Whether the killer moved on, was imprisoned for another crime, or died, no one knows. But his shadow lingered. The cases remained unsolved, the victims mostly unidentified, their stories untold. Cleveland, for all its industrial might, had been humbled by a phantom who preyed on its most vulnerable. By 1938, Cleveland was desperate for answers. The city had lived for years under the shadow of the torso murderer, a phantom who dismembered victims and left their remains in ditches, lots and ravines. With at least 12 confirmed murders, and possibly many more, it had become one of the worst serial killing sprees in American history. The killer seemed to thrive on humiliation, leaving bodies in places where they would quickly be discovered, as if mocking the police. The pressure to solve the case fell heavily on Eliot Ness, Cleveland's director of public safety, a man once celebrated nationwide for bringing down Al Capone. Yet in Cleveland, Ness found himself powerless. Despite raids, interrogations, and round-the-clock patrols, the torso murderer remained elusive. The killer's victims, often transients, drifters, or sex workers, had no one to speak for them, making identification difficult. Without names, motives were hard to trace. Without intact bodies, forensic science was hamstrung. Ness's Kingsbury Run raids, the burning of the city's largest shantytown, were seen as cruel, destroying the homes of the poor while doing nothing to stop the murders. His once brilliant reputation began to fade, and the public's trust eroded. But there were suspects. The suspects. First Doctor, Francis E. Sweeney. The strongest suspect in the eyes of many was Dr. Francis Sweeney, a physician and World War I veteran. Sweeney had served in a medical unit, where he would have gained intimate knowledge of anatomy and dismemberment. He also suffered from alcoholism and severe mental health issues, reportedly violent outbursts included. Police subjected him to 2 polygraph tests, and according to the examiner, he failed both. But Sweeney had powerful connections. His cousin was a US congressman, and despite suspicion, he was never formally charged. Instead, Sweeney eventually committed himself to a mental institution, where he lived out the rest of his life. Some investigators believed Ness was convinced Sweeney was the killer, but couldn't make an arrest without hard evidence. The murders slowed after Sweeney's commitment, but they didn't stop entirely, leaving just enough doubt to keep the mystery alive. 2. Frank Dolezal. Another suspect was Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer who once lived with one of the victims. Police arrested him in 1939 and announced he had confessed. But the confession was full of contradictions, likely coerced under harsh interrogation. Before he could stand trial, Dolezal died in his jail cell under suspicious circumstances. Officials ruled it suicide, but bruises on his body raised questions. Many now believe he was a scapegoat, a desperate attempt to close the case. 3. Random drifters or butchers. Some investigators thought the torso murderer might have been an anonymous drifter, slipping in and out of Cleveland undetected. Others believed he was a local butcher or slaughterhouse worker, given the precision of the cuts. But the meticulousness of the dismemberment suggested medical knowledge more than butchery, fueling the theory that the killer was indeed a doctor. Eliot Ness's frustration. For Ness, the torso murders became a personal failure. He had built his reputation on being untouchable, a man who outsmarted Capone and cleaned up Chicago. But in Cleveland, he faced a killer who seemed to defy capture. Ness launched raids, interrogated suspects, and even personally led searches of Kingsbury Run. But his actions often looked desperate rather than decisive. Burning the shantytown may have displaced potential witnesses as much as it disrupted the killer. In later years, Ness would rarely speak of the case. His career declined, and by the 1950s he was largely forgotten by the public. To many in Cleveland, the torso murderer had beaten him, a stain on an otherwise legendary career. Why the case remains unsolved. The Cleveland torso murders remain unsolved for several reasons. First, the victims were largely marginalised people, making identification difficult and investigation slow. Second, the killer's method, decapitation and dismemberment, destroyed many avenues of forensic work available at the time. Third, the Great Depression created a climate where transience and poverty made people vanish regularly, making it hard to separate murder victims from missing persons. Modern criminologists argue that if the same murders happened today, DNA, trace evidence, and digital tracking would likely reveal the killer. But in the 1930s, Cleveland simply didn't have the tools. Add corruption, political pressure, and public panic, and the truth slipped away. The legacy of the Mad Butcher. The Cleveland torso murderer's legacy endures as one of America's darkest mysteries. He was never caught, never named, never punished. Some believe Dr. Francis Sweeney was the true killer, his crimes ending when he was institutionalized. Others think the murderer moved on, perhaps committing similar crimes in other cities, blending into the shadows of history. The case also left a mark on the city itself. Kingsbury Run, once a sprawling shantytown, was destroyed. Eliot Ness's reputation never fully recovered. And for decades, Clevelanders spoke of the torso murderer in hushed tones, a bogeyman born not of myth but of brutal fact. Even today, the story of the torso murderer chills because of its anonymity. The victims remain voiceless, their lives ended and their bodies reduced to parts. The killer remains faceless, a figure of shadow who could have been a doctor, a butcher, a neighbour, or a stranger passing through. And that uncertainty, more than the gore, is what keeps the story alive. The Cleveland torso murderer was not just a killer. He was a mirror held up to a struggling city, reflecting its poverty, its corruption, and its inability to protect its most vulnerable. And like so many of history's most chilling mysteries, he slipped away, leaving only blood, questions, and silence. The Servant Girl Annihilator. The year is 1884, and Austin, Texas is not yet the bustling modern capital it would one day become. Back then, it was a frontier city, dusty streets lined with gas lamps, horse-drawn wagons clattering along rough roads, and wooden houses scattered across open lots. The railroad had just arrived, bringing new life and business. But Austin was still a place where people lived close to the land, where the line between wilderness and civilization was thin. It was in this environment that one of the strangest and most terrifying murder sprees in American history began. Between 1884 and 1885, a killer stalked the city at night, attacking women, many of them African-American servant girls, in their homes or backyards. The newspapers called him the Servant Girl Annihilator, though some locals preferred darker nicknames, the Midnight Assassin, or simply the Fiend. The first known attack came on December 30th, 1884. Molly Smith, a 25-year-old cook working for a wealthy family, was found murdered outside her cabin near the back of her employer's house. Her head had been crushed with an axe, and her body showed signs of horrific mutilation. Police were stunned. Austin had seen murders before, but nothing like this. At first, many believed it was an isolated act of violence, but within months, another victim appeared. On May 7th, 1885, a woman named Eliza Shelley was attacked in a similar fashion, her skull smashed with an axe while she slept in her quarters. Then, just weeks later, another servant, Irene Cross, was murdered with a knife. Her wounds were described as so brutal that neighbours recoiled at the sight. The city began to panic. These were not random brawls or robberies gone wrong. This was a pattern. Someone was hunting women in Austin, specifically servant women, many of them black, living in small shacks behind their employers' houses. In a city that prided itself on order and progress, the idea of a serial killer prowling the streets at night was unthinkable. As the summer of 1885 wore on, the attacks continued. Some victims survived, giving fragments of description. They spoke of a tall, dark figure, quick and silent, who struck without warning and vanished before help could arrive. But the details were vague, distorted by the shock and trauma of the assaults. The police, ill-equipped and untrained for this kind of threat, had few leads. The killer grew bolder. By late 1885, he was no longer targeting only servant women. On Christmas Eve, 1885, he committed his most infamous crimes. Two prominent white women, Susan Hancock, a respected matron, and Eula Phillips, a young mother, were murdered on the same night in separate locations. Their attacks bore the same brutal hallmarks as the earlier servant killings: bludgeoning, mutilation, and an almost ritualistic staging of the bodies. These murders sent shockwaves through Austin society. It was one thing, in the eyes of many citizens, for a killer to attack black servant women whose lives were too often undervalued in the racially divided South. But when wealthy white women were slain in the same fashion, the city erupted in fear and outrage. For the first time, Austin's elite demanded action. The police response, however, was chaotic. Dozens of men were rounded up and questioned. Pursuers patrolled the streets at night. Citizens armed themselves, keeping watch over their families with shotguns and rifles. Yet the killer struck again, slipping past every effort to stop him. The newspapers sensationalized the murders, feeding the panic. Some compared the crimes to the work of demons. Others insisted it had to be a madman, someone possessed by forces beyond comprehension. Ordinary Austinites began sleeping in groups, believing safety lay in numbers. Families moved into single houses together, bedding down side by side like pioneers under siege. As with later cases like Jack the Ripper, the brutality of the crimes created a surreal atmosphere where rumour and fear thrived. Every shadow seemed to conceal danger. Every stranger was eyed with suspicion. The streets of Austin, once quiet under the stars, now echoed with patrols, dogs, and the nervous voices of watchmen. By the end of 1885, the servant girl annihilator had left at least 8 dead and 6 wounded. And then, as suddenly as the spree began, the murders stopped. Austin was left stunned. Who had done this? Why had they chosen this city, these victims, this time? And where had they gone? Some believed the killer fled. Others thought he had been quietly jailed for another crime. Still others whispered that he had simply vanished into the night, his hunger for blood somehow sated. The mystery only deepened when, 3 years later, Jack the Ripper began his infamous murders in London. The similarities: women attacked at night, bodies mutilated, a killer who taunted society, led some to speculate that the 2 killers were one and the same. Could the servant girl annihilator have crossed the ocean and continued his crimes in Whitechapel? The theory remains controversial but tantalizing. What's certain is that the annihilator's reign of terror in Austin changed the city forever. The murders forced citizens to reckon with vulnerability, shattered the illusion of safety, and left scars that never truly healed. By the beginning of 1886, Austin was a city transformed. In just over a year, 8 people had been murdered and at least 6 others attacked by the mysterious figure newspapers dubbed the Servant Girl Annihilator. The killings had stopped as suddenly as they began, but the fear remained. People locked their doors at night, something many Austinites had never done before. Families who had once prided themselves on southern hospitality now eyed strangers with suspicion. The city's growing confidence, its sense of becoming a modern American capital, was shaken by the knowledge that a phantom killer had walked its streets with impunity. The police, for their part, had little to show. They had arrested dozens of suspects during the year-long spree, but none were convicted. Part of the problem was the crude state of forensic science. There were no fingerprints to compare, no DNA, no modern crime labs. Investigators relied on eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and confessions, the latter often obtained under questionable circumstances. The list of suspects was long, and each seemed plausible in the fevered atmosphere of fear. The suspects. First, local men of interest. In the early months of the killings, police arrested several men from Austin's black community, accusing them with little evidence. Some were jailed for months, their lives ruined by suspicion, only to be quietly released later when the murders continued. The racial prejudices of the time meant that black men were often blamed first, regardless of evidence. 2. Nathan Elgin. One of the more compelling suspects was Nathan Elgin, a young African-American man with a violent temper. In early 1886, months after the last murders, Elgin was shot and killed by police after attacking a woman in public. At the time of his death, it was noted that he had a distinctive limp, something a few surviving victims of the Annihilator had described. Could his death have ended the spree? Some historians think so, though the evidence remains circumstantial. Third, drifters and outsiders. Austin was a growing city, with railroads bringing in transient workers, drifters, and out-of-towners. Many believed the killer was not a local at all, but someone passing through, using the anonymity of the railways to vanish after each attack. This theory gained traction after the murders stopped in Austin, with similar crimes appearing in other parts of Texas and beyond. Fourth, Jack the Ripper connection. The most sensational theory came years later, after the infamous Jack the Ripper murders in London in 1888. The similarities were hard to ignore. Nighttime attacks on women, brutal mutilations and the complete failure of police to catch the killer. Could the servant girl annihilator and Jack the Ripper have been the same man? While no evidence directly connects the two, the timing is tantalising. The Austin murders stopped in 1885. Just 3 years later, the Ripper began his reign of terror in Whitechapel. Both sets of killings displayed unusual savagery, and both targeted vulnerable women. Some researchers have speculated that a British immigrant or traveller could have committed the Austin murders before returning to London. It remains one of the most intriguing what-ifs in true crime history. The aftermath. In the wake of the murders, Austin's leaders tried to restore confidence. They emphasised law and order, increased police patrols, and sought to modernise the city's image. But the scars lingered. For the families of the victims, women who were mostly poor, black or servants, justice never came. Their names faded into history, overshadowed by the sensationalism of the killer's nickname. The city's reputation also took a hit. Newspapers across the country mocked Austin, calling it a place where a fiend could roam freely, killing at will. Some residents even claimed the murders slowed the city's growth, making investors wary of Austin as a safe modern capital. Over time, the case slipped into legend. The name Servant Girl Annihilator was coined by writer O. Henry, then a young Austin journalist, and it stuck. The story was passed down in whispers, a grim reminder of a time when the city's nights were filled with terror. Why it remains unsolved. The Servant Girl Annihilator case remains unsolved for several reasons. First, the victims were marginalised women, many of them poor and African American, which meant the city's leaders did not prioritise their protection until white women were killed. Second, forensic science was too primitive to offer solid leads. Third, the sudden end of the killings meant police never had a chance to catch the killer in the act. Today, the case is studied as one of America's earliest examples of a serial killer, predating Jack the Ripper by several years. It shows how society struggled to understand such crimes, how prejudice shaped investigations, and how easily fear can grip a community. The legacy of the Annihilator. The Servant Girl. Annihilator lives on in Austin's folklore. Some see him as a ghost story, a reminder of the city's darker past. Others view him as a precursor to the age of serial killers, the first in a line of nameless predators who exploit shadows and silence. His story is less well known than Jack the Ripper's, but in many ways just as haunting. Imagine Austin in those years, a city on the edge of modernity, gas lamps flickering in the dark, families huddled together at night, and an unseen figure slipping through the shadows. 8 people murdered, countless others scarred, and no answers. More than a century later, the questions remain. Who was the Annihilator? Why did he kill? And why did he stop? Perhaps like so many of history's phantoms, his true name was swallowed by time, leaving only the echo of footsteps in the dark streets of Austin. The Colonial Parkway Murders. The Colonial Parkway is one of the most scenic roads in the United States. Stretching for 23 miles through Virginia, it winds between historic towns like Williamsburg, Yorktown, and Jamestown. The road hugs the coastline, offering sweeping views of rivers and forests. It was designed for leisurely drives, a place where tourists could soak in the country's heritage and natural beauty. In the 1980s, it was also a favourite spot for young couples seeking privacy. Quiet pull-offs where you could park a car, roll down the windows and listen to the water. But between 1986 and 1989, this peaceful stretch of road became the hunting ground of a killer, or killers, who turned those romantic getaways into sites of terror. Over the course of 4 years, at least 8 young people were murdered, their bodies found in or near cars along the parkway and surrounding areas. The brutality of the crimes, coupled with the FBI's failure to solve them, made the Colonial Parkway murders one of the most haunting mysteries of the late 20th century. The first known case was discovered on October 12, 1986. A jogger spotted a white Honda Civic parked near the York River. Inside were the bodies of Kathleen Thomas, a 27-year-old former Navy officer, and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski, a 21-year-old college student. The scene was horrific. Both women had been strangled with rope and their throats slashed. Their car had been doused with diesel fuel, as if someone intended to set it ablaze, but the fire never caught. The killer had planned not only murder but also the erasure of evidence. Investigators were shaken. The Colonial Parkway was federal land, so the FBI took charge. The case was treated as a high-profile homicide, but despite interviews, searches and roadblocks, no suspect was identified. Friends and family were left devastated, and whispers of a dangerous predator began to ripple through the region. Less than a year later, another couple vanished. On September 22, 1987, David Knobling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14, were found dead near the James River close to the parkway. Their bodies lay on the shoreline, partially submerged. Both had been shot in the head. David's truck was discovered abandoned, windows rolled down, keys in the ignition, radio still playing. To this day, no one knows why they pulled over or who they encountered that night. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. Young couples, remote lovers' lanes, brutal deaths. Virginia's families grew anxious. Parents warned teenagers not to drive the parkway at night. Couples once drawn to its privacy now avoided it altogether. Still, the killer struck again. On April 9th, 1988, the bodies of Cassandra Sandy Haley, 18, and her boyfriend, Richard Keith Call, 20, were discovered near a rest stop off the parkway. Or rather, their car was discovered. Their bodies were never found. The car was abandoned, the interior eerily tidy, but Sandy and Keith had vanished without a trace. Despite extensive searches of woods, rivers and fields, no remains were recovered. It was as if they had been swallowed by the earth. By now, the FBI suspected a serial killer. The victims had little in common beyond their youth and being couples. They were white, black, straight, gay. The killer seemed to care only that they were pairs, alone together at night. The method varied: strangulation, stabbing, shooting, disappearance. But the setting tied them together. Cars, rivers, the quiet isolation of the parkway. The murders didn't stop. On October 19th, 1989, another couple disappeared. Daniel Lauer, 21, and Anna Maria Phelps, 18. Their car was found abandoned at a rest stop, seats pulled forward as if someone had been searching inside. Weeks later, hunters discovered their skeletal remains in the woods nearby. Both had been stabbed. 4 double homicides in 4 years. 8 young lives ended. No arrests, no answers. What made the Colonial Parkway murders especially terrifying was the lack of pattern in method. Most serial killers have a signature: strangulation, stabbing, shooting. But here, the only constant was couples, cars, and isolation. This made investigators consider a chilling possibility. Could it have been more than one killer? Or perhaps a pair of killers working together? The victims' families were tormented not just by grief, but by uncertainty. They were told the FBI was pursuing leads, but months turned into years, and no breakthrough came. Worse, rumours spread that the killer might have been impersonating, or actually was, law enforcement. Some of the victims' cars appeared to have been pulled over neatly, as if by a traffic stop. If true, this would explain why the couples rolled down windows, left keys in ignitions, or seemed to exit their cars without struggle. Who wouldn't comply if a uniformed officer asked you to step out of your car on a quiet road at night? The thought chilled the community. What if the killer wasn't just preying on couples, but also exploiting trust in authority? By the end of 1989, the murders stopped, at least officially. Whether the killer moved away, was arrested for another crime, or died, no one knows. But the damage was done. The Colonial Parkway, once a scenic retreat, had become a place of dread. The FBI's inability to solve the case further fueled suspicion. Families accused investigators of withholding information, bungling evidence, and downplaying the possibility of a serial killer. The Colonial Parkway murders stand today as one of the most baffling and terrifying unsolved sprees in American history. A place designed for leisure and history became a corridor of death, and the killer, or killers, remain nameless, their motives unknown. By the time the last victims, Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps, were found in 1989, the Colonial Parkway murders had claimed at least 8 lives. Families wanted answers, the press demanded justice, and the FBI, in charge of the case because the Parkway is federal land, was under mounting pressure. But what unfolded in the years after the murders has become as infamous as the killings themselves: a trail of false leads, dead ends, and accusations of investigative failure. The investigation. From the beginning, the FBI believed the cases were connected. 4 double homicides, all young couples, all in or near cars along the parkway. It seemed too precise to be coincidence. Yet the killer's methods were inconsistent. Some victims were strangled, others stabbed, others shot. One couple vanished entirely. Serial killers usually follow a signature, but here the only unifying thread was couples, cars, and the parkway's isolation. This inconsistency left investigators divided. Some insisted it had to be the work of one person, adapting methods as they evolved. Others argued there could be 2 killers, or perhaps even a pair working together, a theory that haunted families for years. One chilling possibility was raised early, that the killer was impersonating a police officer, or perhaps was one. In several cases, the victims' cars were found neatly parked, windows rolled down, keys still in ignitions, the kind of calm compliance one might expect if they had been stopped by law enforcement. The idea that the murderer could have been someone in uniform, exploiting trust, made the crimes even more terrifying. The suspects. Over the years, several suspects emerged, but none were ever charged. 1. A rogue law enforcement officer. This theory gained traction when evidence suggested the victims may have willingly rolled down windows or exited their vehicles. If the killer had flashed a badge or simply acted with authority, the couples may not have resisted. Though multiple local officers were investigated, no definitive link was ever found. 2nd serial killer link theories. Some investigators wondered if the Colonial Parkway killer was also responsible for other unsolved murders in Virginia and along the East Coast. The similarities in victimology, couples, isolation, cars, pointed to a larger pattern, but again, nothing conclusive tied the cases together. 3. An FBI informant. In later years, whispers circulated that the killer might have been someone close to the investigation, an informant, a connected figure, someone the Bureau hesitated to expose. Families of victims sometimes accused the FBI of withholding information, fueling suspicions of a cover-up. 4th known local men. At various times, men connected to victims or living near the parkway were questioned. Some were convicted of unrelated crimes, others cleared entirely. No arrests stuck. FB controversies. If the killings themselves weren't disturbing enough, the investigation added a second layer of nightmare. Families repeatedly accused the FBI of mishandling evidence. In one shocking revelation, investigative files and crime scene photographs were mistakenly released years later to the public through a Freedom of Information Act request. For families, this felt like betrayal. The most intimate and horrifying images of their loved ones' final moments now accessible to strangers. The Bureau's communication with families was often criticised as cold or inconsistent. Parents were left in limbo, waiting years for updates that never came. Some even claimed the FBI downplayed the possibility of a serial killer, perhaps to avoid public panic. The result was growing mistrust. The Colonial Parkway murders became not only a story of violence, but also a symbol of institutional failure. Theories. With no conviction, theories flourished. The law enforcement impersonator theory remains the most popular. The victims' behaviour at the scenes suggested they were not ambushed violently, but approached by someone they trusted, or at least didn't fear. The multiple killers theory argues that the differences in method point to more than one predator, perhaps operating independently but along the same stretch of road. The serial killer abroad theory suggests the murders may be linked to other unsolved cases across the US, indicating a transient killer who moved along highways. The lone predator theory, that it was one person, a meticulous killer experimenting with different methods, still remains on the table. Why it remains unsolved. The Colonial Parkway murders remain unsolved for a few key reasons. Isolated crime scenes. The parkway was secluded, making witnesses almost non-existent. Inconsistent methods. The lack of a single signature muddied the investigation. Bureaucratic issues. With the FBI leading the case, cooperation with local police was sometimes strained. Time. Decades have passed. Memories faded, and potential evidence degraded. In recent years, renewed interest has come from DNA technology. Some hope that modern forensic methods may yet reveal the killer's identity, if usable samples can be found in preserved evidence. The legacy. The Colonial Parkway murders haunt Virginia to this day. For families, it is a wound that never healed, children who never came home, parents who never stopped asking why. For the community, it was a reminder that even the most beautiful, tranquil places can harbour danger. Driving the parkway now, you can still see the pull-offs where cars once parked, where rivers glitter in the moonlight, where couples whispered and laughed in privacy. But for those who know the history, those quiet spots are marked forever by the shadow of what happened there. The Colonial Parkway murders endure not just because they were brutal, but because they remain unresolved. A killer walked free, perhaps never caught, perhaps never even suspected. And the silence of the parkway at night, once a romantic backdrop, became instead a reminder of the unspeakable. The Black Dahlia murder. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city of contradictions. On the one hand, it was the land of sunshine and opportunity, booming after World War II with Hollywood glitz, palm-lined boulevards and endless dreams of fame. On the other, it was a place of shadows, where broken dreams piled up as high as the neon lights, and thousands of young women arrived hoping to be stars, only to vanish into obscurity. It was into this world that Elizabeth Short stepped, and it was in this world that she met a fate so brutal it would etch her name into true crime legend, the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was born in Boston in 1924, the third of 5 daughters. Her childhood was marked by hardship. Her father abandoned the family, and Elizabeth grew up yearning for escape. Like many young women of her generation, she dreamed of Hollywood, of being discovered, of turning beauty into opportunity. By her early 20s, she was living in California, moving between Los Angeles and San Diego, working as a waitress, and trying to find her place in a city overflowing with hopefuls. Friends and acquaintances described her as striking, jet black hair, pale skin, always dressed elegantly in black. She loved the nightlife, the clubs and theatres, and often surrounded herself with men. She was ambitious but rootless, never staying in one place for long. To some, she seemed like a social butterfly floating between worlds. To others, she was a mystery, someone chasing something she couldn't quite catch. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Los Angeles awoke to a horror unlike anything it had seen before. In a vacant lot on South Norton Avenue, in the Leimert Park neighbourhood, a woman was found brutally murdered. Her body had been severed in half at the waist, the 2 sections placed neatly in the grass. Her skin was pale, drained of blood. Her face had been slashed from ear to ear in what's known as a Glasgow smile, her mouth carved into a grotesque grin. The scene was so surreal that at first a passerby thought the body was a mannequin, discarded in the field. Police quickly identified the victim as Elizabeth Short. The brutality of her death shocked even hardened detectives. The surgical precision of the bisection suggested medical knowledge. The careful placement of the body indicated staging, as if the killer wanted the discovery to be a spectacle. This was not just murder, it was theatre, a statement carved in flesh. The press swarmed the case, and soon the nickname was born. Inspired by a recent film noir, The Blue Dahlia, and Elizabeth's preference for dark clothing, journalists dubbed her the Black Dahlia. The name stuck, transforming her from Elizabeth Short, a struggling young woman, into a mythic figure of tragedy. From the start, the investigation was chaotic. Detectives interviewed dozens of men who knew Elizabeth. Her social life had been busy, and she often relied on the kindness of strangers for food and housing. She was last seen alive on January 9th, leaving the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. After that, her trail went cold. For nearly a week, no one knew where she was, until her body appeared in the vacant lot. The LAPD received a deluge of tips, confessions and letters. Some men walked into police stations claiming to be the killer, only to be dismissed as attention seekers. The real murderer taunted authorities by sending belongings of Elizabeth's, her birth certificate, photos and address book, neatly packaged to a newspaper office. The envelope was wiped clean with gasoline, erasing fingerprints. Whoever the killer was, they enjoyed the game. Los Angeles was captivated. The case became front-page news for weeks. Crowds gathered at the crime scene despite the gruesome nature of what had happened. For a city obsessed with glamour, the Black Dahlia was the dark mirror, a story of a beautiful young woman destroyed, her body transformed into a grotesque symbol of lost innocence. The investigation stretched on, but the list of suspects only grew longer. Doctors, actors, ex-boyfriends, nightclub owners, anyone who had crossed paths with Elizabeth was questioned. Yet no one could be tied definitively to the crime. The LAPD was overwhelmed, chasing rumours as much as evidence. The brutality of the murder invited speculation that it was more than just a crime of passion. Some saw it as ritualistic, others as the work of a sadist who wanted attention. The surgical skill of the body's bisection suggested the killer may have been a surgeon, or someone with anatomical training, but despite searching medical records and hospitals, investigators never found their suspect. Elizabeth Short was buried in Oakland, California, her family devastated, her life forever overshadowed by the manner of her death. But the legend of the Black Dahlia had only begun. The suspects. The LAPD questioned hundreds of people and formally considered around 150 suspects. Some stood out more than others. 1. Doctors and surgeons. The precise bisection of Elizabeth's body suggested medical knowledge. The cut was a rare procedure called a hemicorporectomy, taught in surgical schools at the time. Police interviewed numerous doctors, medical students and interns. None were definitively linked, but suspicion lingered over the idea that only someone with training could have performed it. 2. Robert Red Manley. The last person confirmed to have seen Elizabeth alive, Red Manley was a married salesman who had been casually seeing her. He dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th. Initially a prime suspect, Manley passed polygraph tests and was cleared. His connection, however, kept his name tied to the case for years. 3. George Hodel. Decades later, one of the most compelling suspects emerged. Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy Los Angeles physician. His son, former LAPD detective Steve Hodel, argued that his father was the killer. George Hodel lived in a house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son, a maze-like mansion perfect for secrecy. He was known for his eccentric lifestyle, often hosting decadent parties. LAPD files revealed he was wiretapped in 1950 during an unrelated investigation. On tape, Hodel was heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." To many, this sounded like a near confession. Yet George Hodel was never charged, and he later fled the country, living abroad for years. His son's investigations made headlines decades later, and many modern researchers consider him the most likely suspect. 4. Other suspects. Theories abounded. Nightclub owners, gangsters, jealous lovers, even actors. At one point, author James Elroy, whose mother was also murdered in Los Angeles in 1958, suggested the Dahlia case was linked to other killings of women in LA during the same era, but nothing ever stuck. The media circus. From the beginning, the Black Dahlia case was as much about publicity as it was about justice. Newspapers sensationalized Elizabeth's life, painting her as a mysterious femme fatale. Stories exaggerated her romantic relationships, her ambitions, even her wardrobe. In truth, Elizabeth was a young woman struggling like many others, poor, adrift, hoping for a better life. But the press turned her into a symbol, the Dahlia, glamorous in death if not in life. Headlines blared lurid details, sometimes invented outright. Reporters hounded her family in Massachusetts, calling before police even notified them. Photographs of Elizabeth were published alongside insinuations of promiscuity. The victim was transformed into spectacle, and the crime into entertainment. This distorted public perception, and it also complicated the investigation. With every wild rumour, the real trail grew colder. The LAPD's failures. The LAPD of the 1940s was plagued by corruption. Detectives were overwhelmed with tips, many of them useless. Leads were mishandled, evidence possibly lost. Some researchers believed the case was compromised from within, with influential suspects protected. The taunting package sent to a newspaper with Elizabeth's belongings was carefully cleaned with gasoline, showing the killer's awareness of police methods. Yet instead of narrowing the field, the investigation sprawled into chaos. Officers admitted later that too many people were interrogated, too many suspects pursued, until focus was lost entirely. The theories. Over the decades, theories about the Black Dahlia have multiplied. medical killer. The surgical precision points to a doctor, possibly George Hodel or another physician. Crime of passion, a jealous lover who staged the body for shock value. Copycat of other murders. Some argue the Dahlia was one of a series of mutilation killings of women in Los Angeles during the 1940s. Organised crime, a theory suggests Elizabeth fell afoul of mobsters, though evidence is thin. None have been proven. The legacy. The Black Dahlia murder endures because it is unsolved, but also because it embodies Los Angeles itself, a city where dreams meet nightmares. Elizabeth Short was not famous in life, but in death, she became immortal, a symbol of both innocence and exploitation. Books, films, and TV shows have kept the story alive. James Ellroy's novel, The Black Dahlia, reimagined the case in noir fiction. Countless documentaries revisit the evidence. True crime enthusiasts pore over files, debating suspects endlessly. The empty lot where her body was found is now just another patch of suburban grass, but for those who know the story, it's haunted ground. The case also raised questions that remain relevant today. How do we treat victims in the media? How does sensationalism distort justice? How much of the Black Dahlia is truth, and how much is legend we've built over decades? Elizabeth Short's grave in Oakland receives visitors every year. People leave flowers not only for the woman who was killed, but for the myth she became. Her story is a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly a dream can turn into tragedy, and how sometimes the truth is swallowed by time.